Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to chapter 32, part 2, okay? And in this, we are going to be looking at the Mexican Revolution. We will be touching just briefly on the Brazilian-Argentinian Revolution, but we will be focusing on the Mexican Revolution. So in part 1, we looked at Africa and India decolonization and Gandhi and what that looked like. And now we're going to be looking at Mexican Revolution and the struggles, and does that really accomplish anything? So we're going to take a look at that today. So you want your chapter questions. We'll be looking at kind of help answer some of those questions as well. Okay, so let's get started. So what are the causes of the Mexican Revolution that starts in 1910, okay? And really, the Mexican Revolution goes from 1911 to 1920. There's a Mexican saying or Mexican proverb that says, and this is a quote from the book, that says, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." And when you look at a lot of their history, a lot of the struggles are not just internally within Mexico, it's other countries. And when I say other countries, unfortunately, I do mean a lot of it being at the fault of the United States, taking advantage of them. If you think back to when we talked about the bourgeoisie proletariat, Karl Marx, and he talks about that constant struggle between the rich get richer at the backs of the poor. Mexico could very well, we could create a similar analogy of the rich in this case being the United States and the poor being Mexico, and the rich getting richer, the United States getting richer at the expense of the poor, which is Mexico. And you're going to see all throughout Mexico's history. We've talked about it before, the Spanish getting rich at the expense of Mexico, the United States getting rich at the expense of Mexico, the Mexican leaders getting rich at the expense of Mexico. So many examples in Mexico's history of the people of Mexico being used and abused by others. And they revolt time and time again, yet unfortunately, permanent change doesn't happen. And this picture really is a good analogy of why revolution comes, yet unfortunately, revolution doesn't pay off in their history. And still today, we see these struggles going on. So unfortunately, the revolutions have yet to bring about the permanent change, institutional permanent, down to the grassroots change that needs to happen, okay? That the people are enslaved, to the land barons, right? So this picture, this kind of cartoon that you see is very much, what is going on. See, the land barons, right? The land holding elite control everything, and the people are working for them and are enslaved, right? Imprisoned to them. In fact, the stat was leading up to the Mexican Revolution that 85% of land was owned by 1%. So that's something that you could use in your questions, but to ask, what were some of the causes or circumstances that brought about the Mexican Revolution? So how was it unique? It was unique in that it was leading up to world wars. They had revolutions before that had not paid off. Why did the revolution take place? The typical inequality, the rich getting richer at the backs of the poor, the continued Spanish elite, the continued inequality of the government, the continued lack of representation, the continued corruption of being sold out to other countries like the United States, taking advantage, and the government officials allowing that. What were the causes of the revolution? Again, inequality, the corruption of the few elite making money and the money not being trickled down to the people that really need it. Mexico has a lot of resources and a lot of riches, but that money does not make its way down to the actual people of Mexico. What impact did the revolution have on other countries? United States didn't like these revolutions. When countries have revolutions, it impacts trade. It impacts the ability for other countries to have access to goods. And so the United States and other countries will often try to intervene because when there's revolution, that interferes with deals that other countries can have. The United States often is one of those. We liked having these deals with their leaders because it led to better, fruitful economic deals for ourselves. And when does the revolution end? It's going to end in 1920. So how does this begin? Well, Porfirio Diaz believed in his motto, life, liberty, and progress. Okay, so life, liberty, and progress was his motto. And liberty was for himself. Freedom was for himself and the landholding elite. Order was what he demanded of his subjects, okay, all of the poor. And progress, again, was for his pocketbook. All right. And he is really going to kind of bring in the revolution because it was a lot of his corruption that his focus, he ruled for 34 years and his focus was very much on the wealthy. There were economic modernizations, but again, the liberty was the laissez-faire. It was the rich getting richer at the expense of the poor. And he prioritized the privatization of the landholding elite, that 1% to 2% owned over 85% of all the land, and allowed America to come in and to industrialize. Most of Mexico's industrialization was owned by America. And so you have Mexican industry that is being run by the United States and being taken advantage of by the United States. So that Mexican proverb that I showed you on that first slide has actually a lot of meaning. It says, so what are the direct causes of the revolution? Okay. Political authoritarianism, basically militarization rule, okay? And you can see that by the way he's dressed. He looks like a military general. He is their president, as he's called, but yet he is a military leader. And unequal benefits of modernization. Again, it's marginalized, that you bring in when countries, this is kind of like what Britain did in India. Remember when we talked about this after the Sepoy Rebellion? They modernized, but who does it actually benefit? When you bring in a railroad and you bring in the telegraph and things like that, all it was doing was helping the British get the resources out for themselves. It didn't actually help the people of India. So when you bring in modernization, that modernization, those factories and things are only helping the United States because the United States owns those factories and owns those railroads and owns the modernization. The people of Mexico were not actually benefiting from the modernization. So it marginalizes. So yes, modernization is coming, but it's only benefiting the wealthy and actually the United States because they own it. Here's a map of, you can kind of see where Mexico is happening, okay? Mexico City was very modern. Diaz did a really good job of, trying to modernize that to appeal to the United States. But again, most of Mexico in the early 1900s leading up to, World War I was very rural, impoverished, and not modernized. So stages of the revolution, okay? After Diaz is overthrown, he's replaced by Maduro, okay? And Maduro is assassinated, and then you see then now a series of other leaders, and you go, once the revolution starts, you have this series of political instability all during the 10 years of revolution. So there are two kind of reformers, social reformers that are going to lead the revolution, okay? So this is, look at these eyes, I love it, okay? This is Emilio Zapata, okay? Emilio Zapata is going to be for land and freedom, okay? For land and freedom, okay? And the Zapatas gave the revolution its social credibility, okay? So he is going to lead a group of kind of rebel cowboys, you could say, all right? And he is going to lead kind of the Southern movement, okay? So the Zapatas are going to be kind of the Southern movement. Now, the thing that was really hard about this revolution is it wasn't just one unified group, it was pockets. And this is part of the reason that the revolution didn't have the overarching success that it could have had, all right? Is that it was a bunch of rebel groups. So the Zapatas are going to be kind of the Southern group led by Emilio Zapata. And unfortunately, he's going to be assassinated in 1919, all right? And basically what he's going to do is he's going to take his cowboys, all right? And what they're going to do is they're going to ride from city to city, and they're going to come down from the mountains, and they're going to attack the large haciendas, okay, these large estates. and they're going to kill the landholding elite, and they're going to take the wealth and they're going to redistribute it to the peasants. So very much kind of a Robin Hood tale, you could kind of say, okay? They're going to kind of ride in with their gang, and they're going to kill the evil landholding elite, and they're going to take the wealth and they're going to give it to the poor. And this works for a while, but it doesn't really create long-term change. It doesn't create institutional change, okay? So it's rebel cowboys doing what they think is best, but it doesn't actually create institutional change. So Emilio Zapata was in the south, and then in the north, okay, you're going to have another movement of cowboys, okay, which is going to be Francisco Villa or Pancho. All right, and they're going to be the northern equivalent of this. And again, kind of this Robin Hood movement, revolutionary masculinity, all right? Also assassinated in 1923. And he'll have 3,000 cowboys that will ride with him in a similar kind of movement, ride into these haciendas, these large plantations where the peasants worked for the landholding, elite, and they're going to kill the landowner, and they're going to take what's theirs, and they're going to redistribute it to the peasants. And again, for a moment, it sounds great and everybody's so happy and this sounds great, but it doesn't change the institutional changes it needs. Do you know what I mean? So just like if you've ever watched the movie Robin Hood, like it's great in the moment and the people think this is great. Yes, we got rid of him. We got rid of the mean baron and he's gone, but there'll just be somebody else that rises up in their place. It doesn't actually create the constitutional government institutional changes. You know what I mean? The policies, the political changes that you need. Okay, so that's the problem when you don't have a unified revolutionary movement. When you have pockets, it creates pocket changes, but somebody else will just replace them. It doesn't actually create the actual long-term changes that you need. There were constitutionalists that would write new constitutions, but about 2 million people died during the revolution. Okay, so we have many different men. You don't have to know all of their names. Okay, there's a lot of them who will write constitutions, who will say they're going to bring about change, but a lot of them weren't believed, and then were murdered or killed by these rebel groups. Okay, so Carranza was assassinated by Zapata's group, all right, that Southern movement group that was just outside of Mexico City. He wrote, or was a part of writing part of writing the Constitution of Mexico. Here's another constitutionalist who proclaimed that he was going to uphold the Constitution. He was also assassinated during war and stuff. So there's a lot of bloodiness going on. Everybody's getting assassinated, okay? The rebel cowboys are being assassinated. The government officials are being assassinated. These revolutions are very bloody. So stages of the assassination, stages of the assassination, stages of the revolution. It's like, what do you need to know? What you need to know is that it was very broken up. Okay, so this is part of the reason that it was not extremely successful, is that it was broken up into pockets, okay? And that with each constitutionalist, yes, they wrote constitutions, but the problem is that the Constitution, while it was written, it wasn't upheld. It was used to kind of pacify, and the United States got involved in this conflict several times because the United States didn't want to get pushed out. The United States liked that we owned so much of their industry, and if we get pushed out, that means less money for us. So what did their constitution look like? Okay, it gave communal landholding rights, regulation of working conditions, so the right to actually form unions and to strike, separation of church and state, so less giving more of a secular state, which is definitely a movement of the West, kind of to mimic what the United States had set up. Right of universal secular education, so pushing for more public education, especially for the lower classes. Democratic elections, no re-elections of presidents, so to have a one-term president, so you wouldn't have a Diaz all over again who ruled for over 30 years and have a military dictatorship. Ownership of nation shorelines, front lines, subsoil resources, so the idea that you couldn't have outside countries like the United States owning industry, that was a big thing. United States wasn't liking this, okay? And United States was getting behind a lot of the different rulers to try to block or limit this Constitution. All right, so we got behind actually quite a few leaders who were definitely not in support of the constitutions. And you would go, well, why would we do that? Because it's in our interest, right? It's in our interest that they don't have they don't have a constitution. It's in our interest that they have a military dictator, because for us that means that we get to own more of their industry. We were making a killing off of them, the rich getting richer off the backs of the poor. So we got involved in several different attacks or attempts to block the revolutionary movements and to support people that would, in fact, we tried to take out Villa, who was a part of the revolutionary movement, because we didn't like that he was pushing for, constitutions and stuff. So we were very much involved in the counter-revolutionary movement until something happened. The Zimmerman Note. You guys remember the Zimmerman Note? Okay, when the Zimmerman Note was sent by the Germans and intercepted by the British, that was being sent to Mexico, right? Tempting them, if they were to attack us, that they could get back some of the southern region of the United States. And then obviously we got distracted. So in 1917, we kind of then left the Mexican Revolution, and then we entered into World War I. So up until that, from 1911 to 1916, we were definitely sticking our nose in the Mexican Revolution, because economically we had a lot to gain. From 1920 to 1940, there's an attempt to try to rebuild, as a nation. It was very bloody. Over 2 million people died. And when you have revolution, these are your own people. Revolutions are very bloody. It's not just half our casualties, half their casualties. It's all your own casualties. Trying to implement the Constitution was very difficult, because you have a lot of corruption. You don't have a lot of industry that's built up, education that's built up. There's not a lot of accountability. Political, financial instability. They tried to do different nation-building projects, opening up public education, trying to renew nationalism, creating more racial equality. From 1934 to 1940, Lázaro Cárdenas is going to be president, and he did make some strides. He implemented the Constitution. He cut his salary in half. He ended capital punishment. He actually redistributed land, so took land back from the wealthy and redistributed it to the poor. Nationalized the oil industry, which was a big deal, because outsiders like the United States had really been capitalizing off of that. Trying to do policies and things that would favor the working class, okay? Made peace with the Catholic Church, trying to create more of a middle class. Took back the oil industry so that the U.S. wasn't, taking advantage of that. Because in the 1920s, Mexico was one of the #1 oil producers, and we were definitely taking advantage of that. Remove generals from government positions. So trying to make it look more like a democratic society and not like a militaristic society. So there were attempts and leaders who really tried to implement this. And so there were eras where there would be progress. But unfortunately, sometimes that progress would be only defined by one man, and they could be undone by the very next president or the very next leader. Some art of the time to show you some soldiers, unification of the time. Pancho Villa and his supporters. So remember Pancho Villa, he was the northern cowboy, or the northern movement of the revolution. And then Zapata, and he was the southern movement. Those eyes, look at those eyes. He's the guy here in the middle. He had some very, very poignant eyes. So what you need to know, this kind of helps sum it up a little bit. The Mexican Revolution does lead to a constitution, so that is a good thing. It does lead to presidents like the example that we just talked about. It does help to remove the United States from Mexican industry, which is a good thing because we had definitely been taking advantage, especially of their oil industry. But the unfortunate thing is that it doesn't lead to the lasting and as much impact as it needed, okay? So it does bring about some change, but not enough change to modernize and get rid of the corruption that Mexico really needs. A couple comments on other revolutions. What about Brazil and Argentina? Okay, so Brazil, or let's talk about Argentina really quick. So Brazil and Argentina, their revolutions are going to be a little bit different. Let's talk about Argentina really quick. So Argentina was known for its cattle and sheep. And remember when we talked about industrialized nations in North, South America? Argentina was the exception, right, that went with the United States and Canada. And that was because of their cattle and sheep industry. They had an expansive railroad, refrigeration industry, and they did really, really well until the Depression. When the Depression hit, they were greatly impacted, greatly impacted, okay? They had what was called an oligarchy, okay? And so an oligarchy is going to be when a small group of wealthy landholding elites are over the majority of their population, okay? Their revolution is going to be much smaller. It's not going to be as impactful as far as making about changes. The Depression really hit them hard because the cattle industry, the price of cattle and things really fell. Probably one of their most well-known eras is going to be, sorry, I just lost my place. Where did that quote go that I was going to read you guys? Where did it go? Okay, it's going to be from, I just lost my place. I'm so sorry, you guys. I was doing so good, and then I just lost my place. Okay, Juan Perón, all right, he's going to be probably one of their most famous leaders, and his wife was really well known, Eva Perón, all right? But here's a quote and basically what he said about his people. Civilians will never understand the greatness of our ideal. We shall therefore have to eliminate from them the government and give to them only the mission with which corresponds to them work and obedience. Okay, so that doesn't sum up, all right, very much the attitude of an oligarchy, all right, that basically the attitude that the citizens don't deserve to have any power, and that the elite should have power. Brazil, before World War I, their exports were mostly coffee, rubber, and rubber from trees in the Amazon. Very little development. Companies like the British were exporting a lot of this rubber, and then that's really going to collapse after World War I. They're going to stop a lot of their exports. They were really peaceful in a lot of the wars. The telegraph is going to come to them after the war, the radio. They're going to take on the railroad. When comparing the revolutions of Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, okay, all three are dependent on trade. They're underdeveloped. The Mexican Revolution is much more bloody. Brazilian, Argentina, not nearly as severe, not nearly as bloody, but also not bringing about as much change, unfortunately. And so Brazil and Argentina will carry on under oligarchy or dictatorships for a longer period of time, and it will take a lot longer to bring about democratic elections, any kind of constitutions or rule in these different countries. Okay, and this is part of the reason even today that we see a lot of these struggles. Even Brazil here most recently, there were questions in their elections, questions of corruption, and a lot of this goes back to is just there is a lack of upholding of the Constitution, And when you don't have enforcement of the Constitution, the whole fundamental industry, political integrity is not intact. Okay? All right. I hope you guys have a great day. And I will talk to you soon.